The idea of piracy was long seen as rebellious and unnatural for women, and for good reason. During the Golden Age of Piracy in the 17th and 18th centuries, women who took to the seas as pirates faced a brutal and unforgiving fate when caught. While piracy itself was considered a crime of great severity by the British Admiralty courts, the transgression was seen even more heavily when committed by a woman. It wasn't just a matter of breaking the law. These women had defied the deeply ingrained societal norms of gender and authority. Pirate trials in the British colonies often occurred in makeshift naval tribunals, set up in locations such as Jamaica or New Providence. These trials were typically swift, held without juries, and with predetermined outcomes. Captured pirates, especially women, were seldom afforded the opportunity to argue their case in a meaningful way. The court's intention was often less about a fair trial and more about sending a message to the public, ensuring that all who witnessed these trials understood the consequences of defying the empire. Women who broke the law were perceived not only as criminals, but as dangers to the established order of the time. Anne Bonny and Mary Read were two of the most infamous female pirates in history, and their trial in 1720 serves as one of the most famous examples of how female pirates were treated. When Anne Bonny was sentenced to death, she famously confronted her lover, Calico Jack, shouting, "If you had fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog." This remark encapsulated the feeling of betrayal and frustration felt by many female pirates, who had often been condemned more harshly than their male counterparts. Their defense was pregnancy a tactic known as pleading the belly. It was a rare legal loophole used by women, which, in Bonny and Read's case, temporarily spared them from execution. However, such pleas were not always successful, and many women pirates faced their fate without any such opportunity for delay. Bonny and Read's temporary reprieve was a rare instance of mercy, but for many women, it was a fleeting hope. Their case highlights the brutal reality that women pirates faced during this period. The reality of being a female pirate in the 17th and 18th centuries was that the punishment often matched the crime: swift, brutal, and public.
Piracy was viewed as an act of rebellion.
But women pirates were seen as doubly guilty. Not only had they defied the law, but they had violated the very gender roles that defined their place in society. One of the most iconic places in history, where pirates met their end, was London's execution dock. Here, pirates, both men and women, were hanged for their crimes. And female pirates, although few in number, were no exception. The hangings took place with great public spectacle, often designed to serve as a stark warning to others. Under British maritime law, piracy was a capital offense. The Piracy Act of 1698, passed under King William III, made it clear that anyone guilty of piracy would suffer the pains of death. The chosen location for executions, execution dock, symbolized the final end for pirates who had once sailed the seas with freedom. Their fate, however, was far from swift. Unlike the typical hanging where the condemned would fall with a long drop, pirates at execution dock were subjected to a short drop. This meant that they would not die instantly, but would instead endure the agony of prolonged strangulation, a painful process known as the marshal's dance. This gruesome method of execution was not reserved solely for men. Women pirates, like their male counterparts, were forced to experience this drawn-out death. Female pirates sentenced to death at execution dock were subjected to the same horrific ritual as their male counterparts. They were paraded through the streets of London in a cart, bound and publicly humiliated by the crowds. Upon arriving at Wapping, the final destination, the condemned were made to stand under the gallows, often with the noose already tightened around their necks. The women's executions were intended not only as punishment for their crimes, but as a public lascina, demonstration of the consequences of rebellion and lawlessness. The punishment served as a reminder that piracy was intolerable, and anyone, regardless of gender, who engaged in it would face dire consequences. Mary Critchett, an American woman who joined a crew of escaped convicts turned pirates in 1729, was another victim of this merciless system. After being captured near Virginia, Critchett was tried and found guilty of piracy. Her execution was swift, without the temporary reprieve of a plea for pregnancy. As was the case with Bonny and Read. The lack of fanfare or delay in Critchett's hanging was reflective of the widespread disregard for female pirates. While their stories may have been captivating, the punishment was inevitable, and there was little room for leniency. Public executions, particularly at execution dock, were not merely about punishing the individual. They were designed to send a clear message to all who might dare to follow in their footsteps. Pirates who faced the noose were not only punished for their crimes but also made an example of for the wider public. The bodies of those who were deemed the worst offenders were left hanging for 3 tides. It's a form of punishment known as gibbeting. This practice, though more common for male pirates, was used as a warning to anyone considering a life of piracy. Female pirates, despite their rarity, were subject to this same cruel fate. They were reduced from legends to lessons, their bodies serving as symbols of the Empire's power to enforce order, regardless of gender. In the eyes of the British authorities, female pirates were not seen as pioneers or figures of rebellion, but as criminals to be eradicated. Their punishment was not only about justice, but about maintaining control and demonstrating the Empire's dominance. These women's lives, their stories, and their legacies were sacrificed in the name of imperialism. Their executions, intended to keep the social order intact and punish those who dared to challenge it. Before the final punishment of hanging, many female pirates were subjected to another brutal form of punishment, flogging. This was a common form of corporal punishment during the 17th and 18th centuries, particularly for those captured by colonial authorities. Flogging, with its painful and humiliating consequences, was often performed publicly, serving not only as punishment, but also as a form of public spectacle. The most commonly used instrument for flogging was the catto, 9 tails, a whip made of 9 knotted cords capable of lashing flesh with devastating effect. Each strike of the whip tore into the skin, causing deep and agonizing wounds. The severity of the flogging varied depending on the severity of the crime. But the women pirates who found themselves subject to this punishment were often at the mercy of the courts. Sentences could range from 12 lashes to more than 100, depending on the discretion of the authorities. This cruel act was performed in public places, often on the docks or outside the prison gates, where crowds gathered to witness the suffering of those who defied the law. Anne Bonny and Mary Read, though not directly recorded as being flogged, were certainly subjected to harsh conditions during their imprisonment. Their story, however, was one of the more notorious instances of female pirates facing punishment. In many cases, such as those of other female pirates caught in the West Indies or the American colonies, flogging was used as a means of extracting confessions or punishing the pirates before they were tried. The public display of flogging was not just about punishing the body, it was about stripping away the dignity and pride of the individual. Women who had dared to defy society's gender norms by taking to piracy were subjected to brutal humiliation, often forced to endure the public gaze as their bodies were whipped into submission. Flogging, however, was not the only fate that awaited female pirates. In some cases, particularly in colonial regions like the Caribbean, West Africa, and the Americas, captured female pirates did not face the noose or the whip, but instead found themselves subjected to forced labor, concubinage, or slavery. While direct records of female pirates being sold into slavery are scarce, it is well documented that many women who were captured aboard pirate ships, particularly those of African or indigenous descent, were often absorbed into the colonial systems as slaves or servants. In Spanish and Portuguese colonies, where piracy, privateering, and slavery often blurred into each other, women captured during pirate raids were sometimes treated as spoils of war. These women, regardless of their role as pirates or mere captives, were often sold into slavery or forced into domestic servitude in some cases. They became concubines to colonial officers, merchants, or wealthy plantation owners. Such women were stripped of their autonomy, their stories erased as they were absorbed into the grim realities of slavery. For them, a pirate's life ended not with a dramatic trial or execution, but with a quiet erasure of their identities. Although the fate of female pirates often went unrecorded in historical documents, what is known is that many disappeared from history altogether, lost to the shadows of servitude. They were not memorialized in the same way as their male counterparts. Instead, they were absorbed into the harsh systems of colonial exploitation, their names and fates consigned to the margins of history. For those female pirates who were not executed or sold into slavery, death still came in another form, aboard prison ships, These decommissioned warships, left to rot in British harbors or colonial ports, became the floating jails where captured pirates were left to languish. The conditions aboard these ships were horrific. Prisoners, both men and women, were kept in overcrowded, dark, and unventilated holds. The stench of disease filled the air as illnesses like dysentery, smallpox, and typhus spread rapidly among the prisoners. Food was scarce, and what little was provided was often rotten or spoiled. The prison ships were a nightmare for those who found themselves confined aboard them. Female pirates were doubly vulnerable, subjected not only to the brutal conditions of overcrowded, disease-ridden ships, but also to exploitation and abuse at the hands of the guards or sailors. Many women prisoners were forgotten altogether, their names omitted from the records, and their fates left unspoken. The presence of female pirates aboard these ships was often overlooked, their suffering ignored or erased from the official accounts. On these prison ships, the pirate's journey did not end with a swift death by hanging. Instead, it was a slow and agonizing process. Many women pirates spent their last days in filth and despair, dying from disease, starvation, or the brutality of their captors. The records do not often tell their stories. Instead, they are lost to time, forgotten in the dark, cramped holds of prison ships that had once sailed the seas in glory, but were now little more than floating tombs. For the women who defied the empire, their fates were often marked by violence, silence, and erasure. The punishment they faced was not just a reflection of their actions, but a reflection of the society that viewed them as doubly dangerous, not only as criminals, but as women who dared to challenge the established norms. The brutal punishments they endured were a reminder of how deeply ingrained the ideas of gender and power were in the imperial systems of the time. The fates of female pirates are often relegated to silence. They are remembered in whispers, in forgotten records, and in the shadows of history. Their names may not have survived, but their stories are still embedded in the margins of history. The way they were punished, the gallows, the flogging, the forced servitude speaks to the deep-seated fear of women who dared to defy the constraints of their time. It serves as a reminder that in many cases their rebellion was punished not just with death, but with the deliberate erasure of their lives from the annals of history. These women, once defiant and free, were ultimately sacrificed to maintain the order of empire. Their punishment was not just about justice. It was about control, fear, and the reinforcement of gendered power dynamics. The fate of female pirates reveals much about how power, law, and gender intersected during the Golden Age of Piracy, and how those who challenged the system were made to suffer the consequences. Often beyond the grave,